they do put us in a dangerous position. They'll be shut down.
At 6:19 a.m., just about 140 miles north of Venezuela's coast, the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. cut through still waters when two Venezuelan jets suddenly streaked into view on its radar. These were not just any aircraft. They were fast jets flying at extremely low altitude, and neither identified themselves via IFF nor opened radio contact. Instead, the two Venezuelan K-8Ws banked sharply across the bow of the carrier strike group, roaring as if rehearsing an attack rather than conducting a routine patrol. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, alarms blipped and heads turned. The escort ships shifted positions, defensive postures went on high alert, and the U.S. crew realized they were being tested. This was not a harmless flyby. From a U.S. perspective, this maneuver looked like a calculated provocation, a stealthy assertion of presence, a signal that Venezuelan military aircraft could close in on one of the world's most powerful warships without warning. And crucially, nobody on the Ford had any inkling that this would be only the first move in a much more dangerous sequence. No one aboard expected what was to come next, when the real dive toward the formation would draw every eye to the skies and every hand to triggers. If you want to stay on top of military secrets, strategic confrontations, and covert moves that change the game, hit subscribe to the Military Power channel, because the story is just beginning. The deployment of the USS Gerald R. to the U.S. Southern Command's area of responsibility sent a clear signal. On the 11th of November 2025, the carrier strike group entered the region with more than 4,000 sailors aboard and dozens of tactical aircraft ready to launch day or night. From Washington's perspective, this was not a routine patrol, but part of a larger push to assert presence, deter illicit activity, and shore up regional stability. At the same time, the government in Caracas has been increasingly comfortable operating in what military analysts call the gray zone, those liminal spaces between peace and war where states test one another without triggering full-blown conflict. For the Venezuelan regime, deploying fast jets close to a U.S. strike group offers the possibility of showing resolve, winning a media moment, and probing U.S. reaction, all without lifting a missile. To understand the stakes, consider what the Ford represents. As the lead ship of its class, the Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier carries cutting-edge systems, an advanced radar suite, electromagnetic aircraft launch system to generate power for future weapons, and the capacity to sustain dozens of sorties per day. In short, for the United States, it is the embodiment of naval dominance. Forward presence, power projection, and sea control at a global scale. On the other side, the Venezuelan jet in this incident, a K-8W trainer attack aircraft, is far less imposing. Developed for training, with lower speed and older technology compared to modern fighters, the K-8W is not built for high-end combat. Instead, it is well suited for the kind of daring close-in maneuvers that create headlines. The contrast could not be clearer. On one side, a floating fortress bristling with capability, on the other, a regional power willing to flirt with danger to make a point. Why choose the early morning for this confrontation? Time and timing mattered. A pre-dawn sortie means fewer civilian or commercial aircraft in the air, less radar clutter, and better chances of capturing compelling visuals, both for U.S. tracking systems and for Venezuelan state media. With dawn light strengthening, it becomes easier to film, photograph, and upload. This helps Caracas amplify the story. We challenged the supercarrier and held our nerve. Meanwhile, from the U.S. side, the quiet dawn meant any unexpected contact raised the alarm quicker and forced all systems into high readiness. As the carrier group steamed north of Venezuela, the first two Venezuelan jets had already closed in, loping across the bow of the formation at ultra-low altitude and without radio communication. From the U.S. perspective, this was a probing action, testing how the Ford's escort will react, measuring response time, and perhaps mapping blind spots. But just as the focus in the Combat Information Center was still shifting, the unexpected happened. Radar picked up two more contacts inbound, approaching fast from a different angle. In that moment, the situation moved from unusual to urgent, and neither side seemed completely prepared for what would follow. By the time the second pair of contacts appeared on the radar at approximately bearing 217 degrees, the calm of the Caribbean morning had already given way to tension. The first two Venezuelan K-8W jets had executed their cut-across maneuver over the bow of the strike group, but for the crew of the USS Gerald R and its escorts, that had felt like a test. Now, with two additional high-speed blips converging from a new vector, Washington's most advanced carrier strike group found itself confronting not merely provocation, but potential escalation. Within minutes, the Ford's command deck ordered the launch of twin FA-18E Super Hornet fighters from the flight deck. This action was no longer routine. It signaled that the United States was prepared to respond if the situation crossed the line. Meanwhile, the escort destroyers and cruisers shifted positions, tightening the protective ring around the carrier. The deployment of these aircraft and the repositioning of escort vessels underscored a pivotal moment. The Americans were treating the incident as more than an aviation nuisance. They treated it as a security incident with strategic implications. What made the moment even more telling was what the infrared sensors revealed. Despite their daring maneuvers, the four Venezuelan jets carried no armaments on their hardpoints. The evidence pointed not to a strike mission, but to a deliberate show of force. By flying close, fast, unannounced, and unarmed, the Venezuelan side appeared intent on creating a spectacle, one that could be broadcast, interpreted, and leveraged politically. From the US perspective, this was a classic gray zone action. Aggressive, but below the threshold of open warfare. Nevertheless, the Americans did not treat it lightly. The Hornets climbed rapidly, radar locked on, defensive posture engaged. The Ford held steady on course, radio silence maintained except for safety-critical communications. The escort ships assumed coverage positions, and the carrier's crew remained focused on the horizon. What the US did not do, however, was attempt to shoot down or jam the Venezuelan aircraft. That restraint was itself a calculated choice, an intentional demonstration that supreme capability need not always translate into kinetic response. Just as the situation seemed contained, a surprise occurred. One of the four Venezuelan jets peeled off from the rest of the group, descending to extremely low altitude. It executed a bold, inverted dive directly toward the formation. From the vantage point of the bridge, the mega carrier and its escort looked up as this lone contrail cut across the sky, screaming toward the bow of a US destroyer. The trajectory, speed, and altitude combined to trigger unsafe maneuvering alerts within the Ford's Combat Information Center. For a moment, it seemed that the entire carrier strike group had to hold its breath. The dive was not an attack in the classic sense. No missiles fired, no target locked for weapons release, but the audacity was unmistakable. In that instantaneous sequence, the Venezuelan pilot had compressed all the danger of war into a single, breathtaking stunt. The US response again remained disciplined. The Hornets shadowed the rogue jet, the escort vessels monitored its path, and the carrier maintained zero deviation from its original heading. More importantly, no defensive fire was initiated, thus preserving the risk-averse threshold that the US sought to present. What happened next moved beyond individual aircraft and into a broader theater of presence and projection. As the Venezuelan jets began to peel away, something on the Ford's radar shifted. For just a few seconds, a targeting radar paint from one of the Venezuelan contacts flickered onto the carrier group. That fleeting lock-on might not have been a missile launch, but in naval air warfare, it often serves as the digital equivalent of a gun being cocked. The US crew absorbed the message. You are visible, you are trackable, you are under observation. Yet the US also sent its counter message. We do not respond rashly. We respond with calculated control. When the smoke of the incident cleared, the Venezuelan jets departed the scene, silent and unarmed, leaving behind a formation of vessels and aircraft that had held its course. From the American viewpoint, this was not a defeat nor a direct combat victory. It was a demonstration of resolve and discipline. The Ford's ability to absorb a daring, low-altitude dive, maintain course, keep its escorts ready, and launch interceptors without escalating into full combat illustrated a strategic advantage that goes beyond the tactical. In short, the four-jet closure played out less like a dogfight and more like a well-rehearsed intelligence gathering or signaling operation. For Caracas, it was a risk-laden theater piece. For Washington, it was an exercise in calm under pressure. The U.S. warship had passed the test not by shooting first, but by staying on course and letting its capability speak for itself. The morning calm shattered in a flash as the four Venezuelan jets closed in on the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group. One of them peeled away from the formation and executed a maneuver that seemed drawn from a pilot's personal recklessness rather than routine procedure. Descending from above 2,000 feet to under 1,000 feet in mere seconds, the jet inverted and plunged directly toward the bow of a U.S. destroyer, escorting the carrier. Everything on the bridge sharpened, radar screens lit up, alarm bells sounded, and computers flagged unsafe maneuver as the aircraft streaked past at such proximity that the crew could almost count rivets on the destroyer's hull. In response, the Ford's close-in weapon systems snapped into automatic tracking mode, their sensors focused on the rapidly approaching jet. This wasn't a drill. The hover jets of the water-cooled rotary cannon were second away from launching into a warning shoot-down state, shifting from monitoring to engaged readiness. Meanwhile, two launched FA-18E Super Hornets accelerated to intercept altitude. Yet protocols held, the Hornet pilots did not lock radar onto the intruding Venezuelan aircraft. They maintained a defensive posture only, clearly defined by U.S. rules of engagement, to avoid turning a provocative act into full-blown combat. Even before the dive, U.S. infrared sensors had confirmed all four Venezuelan jets lacked live ordnance on their hardpoints. That detail mattered. In the silent world of naval aviation, an unarmed flight into proximity isn't a strike. It's a message. It signaled that the Venezuelan mission was designed not to destroy, but to provoke and test. By executing a high-speed dive at extreme low altitude, roughly between 600 and 800 feet, the jet achieved three things simultaneously. It forced a reaction, created dramatic visuals, and signaled that the Venezuelan pilot was willing to blur legal and safety boundaries without firing a shot. From the U.S. perspective, that dive represented far more than a stunt. It was a calculated act of pressure. The combination of timing, altitude, and target proximity was textbook for an unsafe maneuver, a term used by naval analysts to describe any flight path that deliberately risks collision or forces a defensive reaction without crossing the threshold into armed attack. The carrier group held course, the escorts maintained formation, the Hornets shadowed, but the dive sent a clear message. Your staying power won't deter us. You must respond, or your deterrence is exposed. And yet, what surprised the Ford's crew most was not the dive itself. Within seconds of the jet pulling up and moving away, U.S. radar systems detected a fleeting digital lock-on, a targeting paint from one of the Venezuelan aircraft. The significance was immediate. Though no missile was launched, the act of acquiring a target electronically is the maritime equivalent of pulling a trigger. It means you're marked. It means a message has been delivered. And the U.S. saw it for what it was, a singular moment of electronic signaling layered on top of an execution-style maneuver. In that critical instant, the strike group found itself in a hybrid arena. Part aerial provocation, part electronic warfare, part media spectacle. The Venezuelan jet that dived away left the formation but had achieved its aim. It had forced a tracking reaction, triggered defensive systems and created data that could be spun by Caracas as evidence of boldness. The carrier group did not fire, it did not veer, it did not escalate. Instead, it maintained posture and continued its mission. That calm, which on the surface might appear passive, was in fact active power projection, the capacity to absorb provocation without sacrificing strategic integrity. For the US, the takeaway was clear: capability alone isn't enough. In modern sea control warfare, restraint amplifies strength. By preventing a full engagement, by resisting the temptation to shoot first, the Ford Group imposed its own rules of engagement on the scenario. It didn't react out of fear, but responded out of principle. Meanwhile, for the Venezuelan pilots, their dive marked the crescendo of a calculated test. They'd pressed the boundaries, invited a response, and yet remained just below the threshold of war. The risk had been high, but so was the reward. Momentary dominance of the narrative, footage to support national pride, and a rehearsal for escalation. As the carriers and jets drifted into the remainder of the morning's patrol, the dive faded into routine air creep. But its impact lingered, not in the sound of bullets, but in the hum of tracking radars, the hush of surveillance data, and the images that would ripple through both military intelligence channels and media outlets. The battle had not been won by force, but by control. And often, in littoral zones like the southern Caribbean, control matters more than firepower. The moment the 4 Venezuelan jets began to peel away from the main strike group, the crews aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group were already processing multiple layers of threat. But what happened next shifted the encounter from raw aviation drama into full-blown hybrid warfare. In the seconds after the audacious low-altitude dive, radar operators on the Ford logged a sudden paint signal, a radar lock-on from one of the Venezuelan aircraft. Though no missile was launched, the act itself triggered one of the most serious alerts on a carrier's combat information center. Electronic target paint is not simply technical jargon. It means that the adversary's sensors have identified you, tracked you, and potentially prepared for engagement, all without firing a shot. In this instance, the Ford's radar registered the Venezuelan jet's tracking beam aimed directly at the US formation for a fleeting 1 to 2 seconds. Suddenly, the environment changed. It was no longer just about violent maneuvers in the air, but about the digital signature of threat. The carrier group's CIWS and escort ships logged the signal as a step beyond standard provocation. It was a quiet but unmistakable message, signaling that the Venezuelan aircraft had the ability to lock onto the carrier group and could choose to act if it wished. And this kind of so-called gray zone signaling, aggressive but staying below the threshold of direct attack, is becoming a key tool in modern sea operations. States like Venezuela use these signals to test responses, force documentation of their behavior, and shift the narrative to their favor. The media later reported on the larger U.S. task force deployment and pressure campaign in the Caribbean. In fact, according to the Associated Press, the Ford's deployment was part of a regional surge and was described as the largest buildup of U.S. firepower in generations near Venezuela. The radar lock-on therefore read as a deliberate part of that pressure strategy, not simply a pilot stunt. Yet the U.S. reaction offers its own message. The Ford kept course, maintained original speed, and did not alter its heading. The Hornets and escort ships remained in put-down defensive posture, neither escalating nor withdrawing. That steadiness was itself a choice. In strategic terms, by refusing to deviate, the U.S. sent a signal. We are not surprised, we are not intimidated, and we will not allow ourselves to be drawn into a trap. The fact that the carrier did not divert or launch weapons despite bearing the electronic signal shows that control, not impulse, is the modern measure of force. The carrier's calm contrasted sharply with the confrontational tone of the Venezuelan move. The dive displayed audacity, the lock-on displayed intent. Taken together, they revealed a two-step strategy. First, the spectacle to capture attention and force reaction. Second, the digital engagement to test thresholds. And although no weapon fired, the damage was done. The U.S. formation revealed its dispositions, reaction windows, and rules of engagement, all valuable intelligence for future confrontations. However, the story didn't end with the jets' departure. As they vanished over the horizon, the battle shifted medium, from radar beams and warships to headlines and state television footage. Venezuelan state media quickly claimed that the U.S. carrier had been forced to retreat, even though naval and AIS data showed the Ford held its course. The contrast suggested that the real winner in the moment was not the force that fired, but the one that controlled the narrative. From the U.S. side, this event serves as a rehearsal in modern maritime encounters. The ability to absorb a provocative dive, register a targeting signal, maintain formation, and respond only when necessary, all while preserving freedom of action, speaks to the evolving character of power at sea. The deployment of the Ford itself was already a major escalation in the region. Reports describe more than a dozen U.S. Navy ships, plus the carrier moving into the Caribbean, in a campaign the Pentagon termed Operation Southern Warfare. Today isn't just about bullets and missiles. It's about who sees who first. It's about who records the moment. It's about control of the skies, control of the seas, and control of the story. When one side dives low and another holds course, the outcome is less about damage done and more about power defined. As the Venezuelan jets vanished into the horizon and the U.S. carrier strike group steadied its course, the quiet hum of the sea did not mean the event was over. What followed shifted into a different arena, a battle of narratives. In Caracas, state television went live with a headline that reverberated through Latin America and into Washington. The USS Gerald R. Ford had been forced to withdraw from the region. The announcer claimed that the mighty U.S. supercarrier, confronted with aggressive Venezuelan maneuvers, retreated under pressure. Yet the data painted a different truth. Automatic identification system signals, published U.S. Navy movements, and open-source tracking showed the carrier held its heading and speed without deviation. According to Reuters, the Ford's deployment in the region was a clear escalation of American naval presence. The U.S. Navy itself described the incident not as a combat defeat, but rather as a calculated show of force operation, meant to deter, not engage. In essence, Venezuela's media narrative aimed at crafting a symbolic victory. By broadcasting that the Ford had pulled back, Caracas sought to bolster national pride, claim strength in the face of U.S. dominance, and signal to a domestic audience that the regime remained defiant. On the other side, the United States demonstrated that it did not need to fire a shot or turn away to assert power. The Roman principle of showing strength without striking played out in real time across the silent waves of the Caribbean. Behind the scenes, the U.S. military buildup off Venezuela's coast was already drawing scrutiny. Analysts described the Ford's arrival as the largest American military buildup in the Caribbean in decades. The goal, as stated by the Pentagon, was to disrupt narcotics trafficking and degrade transnational criminal organizations in the region. Despite the language of countersmuggling, Venezuela's government perceived the presence as a step toward regime pressure. This alignment between strategic message and tactical posture shaped how both sides responded after the jets had withdrawn. From the U.S. standpoint, the carrier's steady course symbolized discipline under provocation. The doctrine of naval power often emphasizes that the greatest act of strength is to maintain the mission when threatened, not to abandon it. In refusing to alter course, the Ford's strike group sent a silent message. They would not be pushed off station by aerial theatrics. The underlying calculation was that a carrier's value lies not just in its weapons, but in its presence. At the same time, by avoiding escalation, no missiles fired, no major turns taken, the United States avoided a full-blown crisis or the risk of miscalculation. The event became a lesson in control rather than combat. The Ford's ability to absorb the dive, track the jets, launch interceptors, and then continue on its way intact illustrated the modern measure of naval dominance, resilience under pressure, For Venezuela, the ruse of forcing a U.S. retreat served multiple purposes. First, it reinvigorated domestic messaging for Nicolas Maduro's government at a moment of economic hardship and political isolation. Second, it allowed Caracas to portray itself as an actor capable of standing up to the world's largest military power. And third, by triggering a reaction from the U.S., namely the carrier's calm posture and media coverage, Venezuela rewrote the incident as a symbolic win. However, beneath the surface, the real contest was not who fired first, but who controlled the aftermath. Once the jets were gone, the carrier group went back to routine operations, and the Ford's course remained unchanged. Meanwhile, Venezuela flooded its state media feeds with claims of American retreat and victory. It was a reminder that in the era of gray zone warfare, the weaponized medium is often the narrative itself. And yet the ultimate question lingers. Why did Venezuela accept the risk in the first place? When a small fleet of older K-8Ws challenged a carrier strike group, they invited scrutiny, tracked response times, and created data for analysis. By forcing the U.S. to reveal how it reacted, Venezuela treated the incident as a probe rather than a battle. They risked miscalculation because the upside, winning the story, was higher than the cost of escalation. In the end, when the noise of the engines faded and the horizon returned to its normal quiet line, what remained was not the dive, the lock-on, or even the media battle. It was the intention behind it all. For Venezuela, the goal was never to destroy a U.S. carrier. It was to capture a moment. By pushing older K-8 aircraft into the path of the world's most advanced strike group, Caracas created footage that could be replayed, celebrated, and framed as proof of defiance. State outlets later portrayed the encounter as a sign that their pilots were ready to face a superpower. This fit a familiar pattern noted by Reuters, which reported in November 2025 that Venezuela often uses military theatrics to reinforce the image of national resistance during times of political pressure. Yet the American response revealed something far more enduring. The USS Gerald R. Ford held its course. The escort ships maintained formation. And the U.S. Navy chose discipline over escalation, demonstrating that strength is measured not only by capability, but by control. The carrier's advanced radar, defensive range, and air wing readiness, documented widely by the U.S. Navy's public affairs releases, showed a force that did not need to react loudly to prove its superiority. The incident became a clear contrast between symbolic power and real, operational dominance. As the strike group continued its mission, a question lingered over the water. If you were the commander on the bridge of the USS Ford that morning, would you have held course as the U.S. Navy did, or taken a more forceful approach? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to Military Power for more deep dives into the military events shaping our world today.